Welcome to the Books and Music Review Show. The opinions and views expressed on this program do not reflect those of the management and staff of Staten Island Community Television. So, welcome to the show, Gerard.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that warm introduction. Today we're going to be talking about a very complex issue and one that's that attracts a lot of publicity and a lot of you could say a lot of heat, but not much light. And that issue is the Middle Middle Eastern Middle Eastern conflict between, excuse me, I'm sorry, the the Arab-Israeli conflict, but in particular, the, the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israeli government. Now, the to just give you a brief overview of what of how we arrived at this state of affairs. The Israel declared its independence in about 4 years after the conclusion of World War II, after the ingathering of the diaspora, primarily Jews who were living in Europe during World War II and survived the Holocaust. Now, during the war itself, Britain had suspended immigration to Palestine, the mandatory Palestine, which they controlled. So, um, there were various routes that Jews living in Europe and Zionist organizations specifically used in order to rescue Jews and relocate them to then what was then Palestine, the British mandated Palestine, and this um, this presented a problem for the British because they had made promises to the Arabs who were living in living in that region in order to get them to support the British side during World War II, just as they they had promised the Jews a homeland years before with the Balfour Declaration. So by the time World War II ended, you had two parties that were really um, irreconcilable. But I think it should. I think you should. The emphasis here should lie with the people who rejected the idea of an independent state, because there was a UN resolution dividing the area in two, with the Arabs living within Palestine getting around 52%, or a little over half of the territory, and the Jews who would later declare an independent state, Jewish state of Israel, getting around 48%. So, um, what would become Israel, the people living there, and the political parties accepted this division, but the Arabs, particularly the Arab states outside of what was then Palestine, refused to accept it and declared war. Now, the fighting was already happening. There were already attacks on Jewish settlements and Jewish cities by by Arab militias and also neighboring Arab countries like Jordan and Syria. But by the time Israel had declared independence, and afterwards a full blown war had engulfed the region, and the countries neighboring Israel were trying to destroy the incipient state. They were trying to eradicate Israel even before it had a chance to establish itself as an independent nation. So that's where that's basically the root of the problem in terms of contemporary uh, the contemporary Middle East. Even though the conflict predated that, there were pogroms in Hebron and um, other cities within um, e- even before the British assumed control. When it was part of the Ottoman Empire, there were attacks on Jewish inhabitants of that region. But the conflict in 1948 and 49. That's where the root of the root of the problem is. So that brings us that brings us to today, where recently, within the past 3 days, there has been what's being described in the press as a march, or the march, the Gaza March, which essentially involves Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip going up to the border of Israel and trying to breach the border. Some of them, a lot of them are protesting. Some of them and this is a familiar image of setting tires on fire, and some of them throwing Molotov cocktails, and some of them doing even more dangerous, quasi, almost warlike actions, like setting up explosive devices near the fence that separates Gaza from Israel. And the way it's being portrayed is as a Israel. It's basically being portrayed as Israel willfully attacking and killing Palestinians who are peacefully protesting. Now, even though there are protesters who were nonviolent, the actual march itself was conceived of by Hamas, which is a an Islamic terrorist group in charge of the Gaza Strip, and which has been in charge of the Gaza Strip since they violently overthrew the Palestinian Authority that governed that area. And the the actual impetus for the march, even though it's described as a commemoration of Land Day, which was a protest within Israel by Arab residents of Israel in 1976. It's being described as a commemoration of Land Day. That protest was designed to object to a land expropriation scheme that the Israeli government undertook, where they expropriated 20,000 dunams of land, and 6,000 of those belonged to Arab residents. So they protested the land seizure, and it resulted in 6 deaths. And this has been an event that has been marked by the Palestinians ever since, for the past 4 decades or so. Now, the Gaza March is being described as a commemoration of that event, which happened on May 30th. So that's when it began, but the actual underlying reason is related to the fact that Hamas is having trouble governing the Gaza Strip and has been ineffectively governing the Gaza Strip ever since they seized control and overthrew the Palestinian Authority. They focused mainly on instituting Islamist laws like preventing women from riding motorcycles or smoking hookahs, which is that pipe device that you see in all in Arab culture, where you smoke a something called shisha. Shisha. I can't even pronounce it, but you basically smoke it through this pipe, which is called a hookah, and stuff like that, banning women from smoking that, or enforcing Islamist dress codes, or persecuting the Christians that are living in the Gaza Strip, who are some of the oldest Christians on the planet, and have been around since the time of Jesus. So they've done a lot of they've enforced a lot of these policies that are very similar to Iran, which is one of their sponsors. But they haven't been able to really improve the economy. In fact, most of the cement and the building equipment that has been imported or has been allowed to come into Gaza has been used to build things like underground tunnels into Israel for attacks and things of that nature. So the people within Gaza are very discontented, and one of the ways to I should also add the idea that it's an open air prison camp. It should be noted that there's also an Egyptian blockade on the Gaza Strip. It's not just Israel punishing the Palestinians for their for electing a government that wants to destroy Israel. It's also the Egyptians who have a problem with Hamas because it's part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which wants to take over Egypt, and was actually in charge of Egypt for a short period of time. So the government in Gaza wants to kind of divert attention from these issues by focusing attention on their age-old enemy of Israel. And I think this is one aspect of the story that's not getting a lot of attention in the press. For example, the fact that out of the I think somewhere between 17 and 19 people have died in these clashes along the border between the Gaza Strip and Israel, and out of that number, it's already been confirmed that 10 of them were members of either Hamas or groups like the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is a terrorist group led by or created by the party Fatah, which governs the Palestinian Authority. So most of the people that have been killed so far are actually involved in violent activities against Israel. They weren't demonstrating to um, protest so much as using the protest as a cover to implement their real their, their ideology. In fact, one of the people who died was actually a commander, a company commander in Hamas, so the equivalent of a brigadier general in that in their structure. And it's kind of a diversionary action. Recently, Hamas, or it's been attributed to Hamas, the attack on on a caravan of Palestinian officials, high-ranking officials in the Palestinian Authority. One of their limos was attacked with a bomb, and even though no one was injured, the attempt is widely thought to have been conducted by Hamas. So you have this constellation of events that have very little to do with Israel or the actions of Israel, and the way it's being framed internationally, and even within Israel itself to some degree, is that it's being framed as a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza, rather than an intra-Palestinian conflict that's being weaponized and used against Israel instead of focusing on the conflict, the pretty obvious conflict between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and how this is being used as a distraction to bolster Hamas's rule over the Gaza Strip. You have the press focusing on the deaths of Palestinians during the Gaza, the so-called Gaza caravan. It's a bit of a red herring when you stop and examine it. A lot of the previous conflicts that have arisen since Gaza has been under the control of Hamas. For example, Operation Protective Edge, which happened in 2014, or Operation Cast Lead, which happened, I think, in 2008. A lot of these conflicts were rooted in the Hamas government trying to divert attention from its failures, its economic and political failures, and the discontent among certain sections of the populace, to a more useful target in the case of Israel, which they find, where they can find unanimity and or at least broad support among the Gazans living there. Without Israel responding to Hamas attacks, Hamas would be forced to grapple with the prospect of governing governing the province, and the people who are in charge in Gaza uh, are not capable bureaucrats or economists or people that you would expect to be be very good at managing the political affairs of a million people. So, I mean, they're good at issuing fatwas and imposing Islamic restrictions on daily life and attacking their enemies, whether it's Israel or the PLO, the Fatah in who, which is the group that controls the Palestinian Authority. They're good at planning attacks and making violent speeches, but they're not very good at actually managing the economic and political affairs of the people who ostensibly elected them. So I think you have to take that into consideration. The fact that Hamas is not really a governing entity, kind of like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt when they were elected. Um, Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, when they were elected by Egyptians, they weren't able to um, implement any sort of effective regime because they had spent the past 8 decades essentially agitating against the Egyptian government and calling for the implementation of Sharia and the transformation of Egypt into an Islamic state, but they didn't have any coherent economic ideas or political ideas on how to address the problems that Egyptians were facing. And it's the same problem in Gaza, which is why you see the outbreak of violence. And I think that's another aspect that the media is not really focusing on, the fact that the Gazans are the Gazans who are participating in this. Many of them were actually trying to breach the border of Israel, cutting the fence and trying to make an incursion into Israel. Now, in the southern border that we have with Mexico is very porous, and there's not enough there's not enough done to actually enforce the border. But when there are conflicts that happen, and I'll give you just one example. When there are drug cartels that use children or pre-teenagers or teenagers to create a diversion, to throw rocks at Border Patrol agents as they're patrolling the border, and to distract them while they smuggle drugs into the United States or smuggle people. They'll use rock throwers within Mexico to attack the Border Patrol agents along the border. And very often, the Border Patrol agents will have to shoot at the people being used as decoys, and some of these encounters actually result in fatalities, and the Mexican rock throwers being shot and even killed in some instances. Of course, this is done as self-defense when when you have 3 or 4 dozen people throwing rocks at you. You're essentially being your life is more or less being threatened. But I don't think that, and this has actually become a controversial issue. Some left wing um, activists and um, anti immigration enforcement activists have denounced this, and it's even become a cause celebre among certain newspapers, and there have been documentaries about this. But most Americans would probably say that Border Patrol agents should be able to enforce the law and also protect their lives. And just to circle back to what's happening in Israel, I think most people would agree that Israel should be able to enforce its border. No one agrees that killing innocent protesters is right, but if the protests aren't innocent, if they're actually violent protesters trying to make an incursion into Israel and coming across the border, it makes sense to prevent that from happening, especially when you have terrorists embedded within these groups of allegedly nonviolent protesters. Just like in Mexico, you have drug cartels going across the border, violent drug cartels going across the border and using rock throwing teenagers as a cover in order to violate the U.S. and carry on the illegal narcotics trade. And I think that's the main. I think that's the main issue here, like whether or not countries have a right to defend their borders, even violently, if it's in retaliation to violent incursions in upon their sovereignty. It's a complex question, but I think it needs to be aired rather than just have people trying to elicit sympathy over tragic um, circumstances like what's happening in Gaza. I mean, the fact that there were children brought to a violent demonstration where 12 people had already been killed, even after a dozen people had been killed, bringing your children there is, I mean, that's an indication that the intentions behind the people who organized this were not benign. I had a debate with someone about this, the Birmingham Children's March, comparing it to that. But if the people who organized the Children's March had known that the children would have been killed, or had seen their children killed, they wouldn't have brought them to protest the discriminatory laws in Alabama. So I think that there is a marked difference there. I think people need to look at, like, really examine the motivations behind these events when they hear about them, and not just resort to emotion or have an emotional response that's not based on look at understanding the actual issues involved. All right. So did you put the?
We're on air. We're on air now because we have an hour show now. So, I just dropped my phone, so I'll have to bend down and get it. So welcome to the Books and Music Review Show. I'm going to talk about